Okay, let's say our Asuk B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanenu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, we have here a picture of Esther Hamalka, Queen Esther Street in Jerusalem. This is from a bus in Jerusalem. Our prologue, where the King Ahasuerus, has a party where all the guys get drunk. He wants his wife to come and be admired. She refuses, and the advisors are worried that she will set a terrible example for all the other women in the Persian Empire, and so therefore she no longer is allowed to come before the king, and her royal status gets given to someone else. It was pointed out to me this year that that it says a royal edict should be issued, that Vashti should never enter the presence of the king. And so the royal edict that is sent out to everybody is that every man should wield authority in his own home and speak the language of his own people. It doesn't actually mention Vashti in the news that's sent out to everybody, which is an interesting, I think, thing that I hadn't noticed before. All right. What we're calling Act 1, which is Chapter 2. The king decides that he wants a queen, another queen, so all the young women are caught up in the royal dragnet, and Esther is one of them. And so she wins the favor of the king and everybody else that she encounters. And then she doesn't tell anybody that she's Jewish, per her guardian, older cousin Mordechai's instructions. And then Mordechai tells her, and she tells the king about a assassination plot, which is then foiled. Chapter 3, Haman is promoted. Mordechai doesn't bow down to him. Haman doesn't notice at first, but the courtiers eventually tell, they ask Mordechai, and he doesn't do as they suggest about bowing down. So then the courtiers blame Haman, or tell Haman about this to see if Mordechai's resolve would prevail. So it seems to me as if this is like the courtiers are setting up a gladiator match, basically. But if they hadn't said anything, probably we wouldn't have had this whole Purim story. So since they did talk to Haman, we get Haman convincing the king that the Jews should be killed on the date that he chooses. Chapter 4, Mordechai puts on sackcloth and ashes, and Esther finds out why and discovers the decree, and Mordechai convinces Esther to talk to the king. Which brings us to chapter 5. So, Diane, would you read this, please?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
So, on the third day, Esther put on royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room facing the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended to Esther the royal scepter, which he had in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. "What troubles you, Queen Esther?" the king asked her. "And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be granted you." If it please your majesty, Esther replied, let your majesty and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him. The king commanded, tell Haman, tell Haman to hurry and do Esther's bidding. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. Do you want to scroll?
Okay.
At the wine feast, the king asked Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be fulfilled. My wish, replied Esther, my request. If your majesty will do me the favor, if it please your majesty to grant my wish and accede to my request, let your majesty and Haman come to the feast which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do your majesty's bidding. That day Haman went out happy and lighthearted. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the palace gate, and Mordecai did not rise or even stir on his account, Haman was filled with rage. Nevertheless, Haman controlled himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman told them about his great wealth, his many sons, and all about the king, and all about how the king had promoted him and advanced him above the officials. And the king's couriers. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king, she did not have anyone but me. And tomorrow, too, I am invited by her along with the king. Yet all this means nothing to me every time I see that Jew Mordecai sitting in the palace gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a stake be put up 50 cubits high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go with the king to the feast. The proposal pleased him, and he had the stake put up.
Thank you. All right, so chapter 5 of the biblical book of Esther. What might Esther be thinking during any part of this chapter?
I don't have any thoughts, but I'll pose the question to others. Why it took her 2 days to make her request.
I thought she was fasting during that time.
Yeah, that's true.
She was getting herself ready. She was petrified because she was scared that she's gonna get killed.
Yeah, that's good too.
She very gently and slowly built up to what she really wanted so that nothing would happen to prevent that meeting from happening. I think she was smart.
Well, I mean, after a 3-day fast, it probably takes quite a bit of, getting up to go approach the king. That had to be exhausting.
I think if she, putting it my way, I think she felt if she played her cards right, she stood a chance, even if it was slim. But if she played her cards wrong, as my other classmates have said, she would die.
You want to put
she had to be
Haman at his
deliberate.
ease, so when she caught him, she'd be taken off guard.
I think also, I can't imagine she's asked what she wants, really ever. And he's saying that he'll, give her half the kingdom. And I imagine that you have to be very strategic in how you answer that, but also, it would be kind of a crazy position to be in.
I was asking partly because I have to admit, I'm a bold person and but I do have those moments where I know there's a lot on the table and I chicken out. And it's not that I chicken out completely, but the moment comes and I kind of delay it. That's frankly what was crossing my mind when I saw that. I said, she like me sometimes and says, I can't do this right now. I have to gather myself, which people have already kind of articulated.
Maybe she's thinking of plan of action, or maybe the king isn't in his throne room every day.
So what might Esther be thinking, besides the things that you talked about her thoughts about waiting until the second day to ask her question? What else might she be thinking during this chapter?
What am I going to do? How am I going to lay whatever? I have to prepare the food. It may take time. It might not have, there was no refrigeration. You had to acquire it and prepare it. I would be thinking about how I would, what am I going to say? Maybe practicing it a few times and considering what happens if this or that, and how do I counter an argument? Maybe I would think about those things, so I'm prepared for the meeting.
Might be thinking she didn't want to disappoint Mordecai.
That's for sure. And more than Mordecai.
Maybe she was afraid to say, that she's Jewish, and the minute she says that she's Jewish, then she'll be killed off.
All right. So the related question, what might she be feeling during this chapter?
Apprehensive.
Fate of her people is on her shoulders. She bears everything.
Anxious.
Suspenseful, considering the part where Zeresh is recommending a height of 50 cubits to hang or impale Mordecai. I'm thinking to myself, gosh, 50 cubits sounds pretty tall, even though I don't have any conversion table for that.
David, is there anything to that 50 feet? Any symbolic or purpose to it? 50 cubits, I'm sorry, 50 cubits.
It seems like a lot of detailed oriented people are involved. Esther thinking of what she's going to be serving up and doing at the banquet. And, Zeresh at the same time is thinking about the details of how to, impale Mordecai. These are they're very different women thinking about very detailed plans of what they're going to be doing.
According to the internet, a cubit is about 1.5 feet.
I actually have a thought. I heard a guest rabbi speak to us and suggest that the 50 cubits was a unique length and happened to be the length of one of the poles of the ark, Noah's Ark.
It's the distance between the thumb and outstretched finger to the elbow.
That's 1 cubit, right?
1 cubit.
It's about 20 inches, 1.5 feet. Depends if it's a man's arm or a woman's arm.
A lot of mathematics was involved.
Well, they had standards.
What else might Esther be feeling during this chapter?
The whole jewelry is on, like relying on her to save them. So that's like, a heavy weight on her shoulder because everyone is relying on her, including her uncle Mordecai.
Even though I agree with much of what's been said, there's a part of me that thinks Esther is feeling slightly confident that she's going to win this. And I'm not sure why, but there's something about her methodology and her persistence in I want to prepare a meal for you and Haman that suggests that she kind of knows it's going to be okay. I don't know where that's coming from. It's just a feeling I have. Maybe because she trusts Mordecai, maybe because she thinks the king does love her and will do what she wants.
I have a thought for Hinda that the fast is a technique that's used in Talmud to reduce or end droughts and periods of no rain for extended times. So if righteous people succeed in that maneuver in times of Talmud, then perhaps, I don't know how this compares to the time of Talmud for her, how much she knows about it, but Mordecai would know about it probably as a leader and a sage. But perhaps she had faith in the fast, that if their cause was righteous, meaning our cause, that the fast would succeed, and maybe that was her faith. That's my thought.
All
I
right.
think it makes sense that she would be nervous or anxious, but I also think that she could be angry and frustrated at the situation. And she's not acting in a rash way with anger, but I think there's another kind of anger also where she's developing this plan to, ultimately deceive and trick everyone to make what she wants happen. And I think there's a kind of deep anger that can fuel that kind of thinking.
Let's go to chapter 6, unless there are more thoughts on chapter 5. Gary, are you up to reading this week?
Yes. I
Great.
can't get myself on muted here. All I see is myself. I can't see the text.
Oh no.
There we go. That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. There it was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigtana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. What honor or advancement has been conferred on Mordecai for this? The king inquired. Nothing at all has been done for him, replied the king's servants who were in attendance on him. Who is in the court? The king asked, for Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai impaled on the stake he had prepared for him. It is Haman standing in the court. The king's servants answered him. Let him enter, said the king. Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king... Can you scroll?
All right. There we go.
Okay. What should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garb which the king has worn be brought, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal diadem has been set, and let the attire and the horse be put in charge of one of the king's noble courtiers, and let the man whom the king desires to honor be attired and paraded on the horse through the city square, while they proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Quick then, said the king to Haman, get the garb and the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at in the king's gate. Omit nothing of all you have proposed. So Haman took the garb and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and paraded him through the city. To the city square, and he proclaimed before him, this is what is done for thee. Can you scroll it? David?
You might be frozen.
It sounds like it, looks like it.
But I know the end of the line. This is what is to be done for he whom the king wishes to honor.
Oh, thanks.
He's back.
Sorry about that. Let's bring back. Yep, that was last week. Our last one. All right, here we go.
Where are we?
Verse
12.
12.
12.
Okay, I'll read. So Haman took the garb and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square, and he proclaimed before him, "This is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. There Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had befallen him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin." While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared.
All right, thank you. So this is chapter 6. Now, Esther isn't in this particular chapter, but assuming that she heard about any of this under the theory that news traveled in the palace, what might she have been thinking during this chapter?
Total confusion between Haman wanting to kill all the Jews and having to parade Mordecai royally through the streets. She could easily be confused about what's going to be happening.
If I can share something that a completely different approach to the book of Esther pointed out, that there actually may be some historical references in Esther to things that happened during the time the Jews lived in the Persian Empire. That one way that that particular scholar looked at this section right here that I'm twirling the cursor around, that King Ahasuerus would have understood from what Haman said, assuming that these honors were for him, that Haman really wanted to become king instead of Ahasuerus. And that by turning it on its tail, that he would do that for Mordecai, and that Haman would have to lead him through the city, that was a good way to blunt that larger plot of Haman to usurp the kingdom. And apparently this was, this particular scholarly view was based on something that happened in Persian history. Obviously the names are different, but those scholars equate Ahasuerus with a certain Persian king, Artaxerxes or something like that, and Haman with a certain person who was high in the court of Artaxerxes, who the historians have found evidence actually was trying to usurp power.
Sounds like Macbeth.
All right, what else might Esther have been thinking?
I mean, this feels like a pretty big win. I think going from they're planning to kill Mordecai to the king celebrating him. I mean, to me, I would worry that it could somehow put some more of a target on his back to be in this public procession or whatever. But I mean, this would be, I think, very happy news compared to everything else that's been happening.
And I think for a lot of us, you get the happy news, but then you kind of wonder, what's going to happen afterwards. You know, what's the bad news that's going to come on top of the happy news?
Yeah.
I'm confused about Haman's wife and those who heard his lament about Mordecai and Haman bearing his head like a mourner, and her saying, if this guy is a Jew, you're going to fall to him. All of a sudden, that's a complete unanticipated response by his wife in my mind. So I'm wondering where she gets that. What does she have? And what inside info does she get that makes her say that? Because there's already the decree that's standing out there to kill the Jews. And I don't know how Mordecai is perceived to overcome that in Haman's own house by Haman's own wife. So this is a turn of events for me. I'm confused about this account.
It is a fair question. Like, what leads her to this conclusion? Unless we think that it's just the narrator, or the author trying to put in some foreshadowing. But assuming we're not looking at it through that lens, then that does raise the question that you have brought up, Barry.
What pops into my head is, when the people first entered the promised land and started taking, conquering cities and so forth, their renown had gone before them, what God had done for them, so that, people were actually afraid of, afraid of them. And I forget who the people were, but they came, and I forget who the people were right offhand, but they were so afraid they came and, like, of course, it's been a while since I read this, but anyway, so there was that thing, there, I think there's renown, and there were obviously people who were high up in the Persian Empire over the period of time that they were exiled there and that sort of thing. And so, I mean, there were stories about Jewish people who had, who had been powerful. And I think there may have been some, I'm just tossing this up for thought, obviously. So I'm wondering if it's something like that, that people were aware in a similar way. I don't know if I'm making sense or not, but anyway, hopefully it made some sort of sense. Of course, the flip side of that is the flip side of that is he had made the Jewish people out to be these horrible, terrible people that needed to be exterminated because they were vermin on the face of the earth. I mean, that's basically what he told the king. And here the king has chosen somebody to give him honor higher than Haman. And that may be another reason that because this was a great, great honor. And so that may be the other reason. Because here's an example where they're not terrible and they're not against the empire and they're actually for the king.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking it would be like kind of humiliating for him to kind of take this stance so boldly against the Jews and then for especially this one man that he's targeted to be praised by the king after Haman's been close with the king, serving him for, I don't know, I assume a while. I think it would be a total blow to the ego.
We could probably do a whole treatise on the psychological ramifications that this was having to Haman.
Back at the end of chapter 2, Mordecai discovers the plot by Bigtan and Teresh. He tells Esther, Esther tells the king, everything gets written down. Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name and everything gets written down. In your imagination, did Esther assume that anything was going to come of that beyond just foiling the plot?
Well, one thought that I had is wondering if Esther felt that if there were these two guys plotting to kill Ahasuerus, maybe there's more, that are willing to do that.
So by revealing the plot, what impact would that have on the others that might be out there?
I don't know, maybe Ahasuerus would be more guarded, or be interested in finding out who else might be his enemies.
Mm.
Good night.
I would think the king would want to know why the message went to Esther from Mordecai in the first place, because supposedly he knew Mordecai was a Jew. He didn't know that Esther was. He probably didn't realize that Esther was related to Mordecai. So how would Esther have gotten the message from Mordecai in the first place?
I'm guessing it was known that they were related back from the time of the seeking of the new queen, and that their Judaism just wasn't known at that time, and now it's starting to unfold that Mordecai is Jewish. Esther hasn't played her hand about disclosing that yet. But the question that was asked about Mordecai, what did Esther think about? David, your question, it was a good one. What would Esther may have had in mind, and the answer to the question, the way you phrased it, I heard it then, was yes. My mind, that she would have thought that Ahasuerus would have paid some sort of respect and appreciation toward Mordecai, because Ahasuerus seemed to have already been the kind of guy who could be easily persuaded by his inner circles and people around him. Hey, Vashti's not obeying you. All the women of the realm are going to start to disobey their husbands. Let's get an edict out there. And Ahasuerus says, okay. I mean, Ahasuerus seems to be prone to taking all this advice from his people around him. So if Mordecai is known to be a king's lifesaver, regardless of who else is out there, the king might be appreciative of that particular event and take Morris's approach about looking around for seeing if there's anybody else out there as well. Good.
Just building off of that a little bit, perhaps also foiling this plot could have maybe it could have also had potentially, in Esther's mind, the implication of maybe Ahasuerus finding more respect for the exile arcs. Because if I remember correctly, at the time when the story is set, they would have still existed over the Jewish community that was in Babylon. Although I know the story doesn't take place in Babylon, perhaps they could have had some influence, maybe, or maybe Esther expected that perhaps the king would contact them and they would establish some kind of relationship with those leaders, since the Persians, I believe, controlled the city of Babylon at this point. Is that correct, David?
Yes.
That's my sort of speculation. Maybe she was thinking about that.
David, there was a line toward the bottom of this chapter. There it is. If Mordecai that whoever said to him, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. That just sounds like something out of a current anti-Semitic rant. And it really makes me, and I've never noticed that before, but it really makes me wonder, because this was written by Jews, not non-Jews, if at that time this was sort of a common line of thought that they ran up against. And it just helps to show how far back this line of anti-Semitism runs.
Some people argue that that's the entire point of the book of Esther.
With that point that you raised, it's worth looking at what Haman said to the king, which was back in chapter 3. Verse 8. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. So that would be another line of anti-Judaism, at least, what would later become anti-Semitism, xenophobia. These people are different from us, therefore that must be bad, therefore we must get rid of them.
The only law we know of, if it really was a law, that Mordecai did not obey was to bow down before Haman. And we don't have any indication here that the king had any anti-Semitic feeling. He just was prone to whatever Haman wanted to do.
Look at the next couple of lines and ask yourself that question.
And it's funny when we read that verse 8, it didn't strike me as being anti-Semitic the way that this one did. And I don't know why.
It's not the one in chapter 6 is, I don't want to say it's playing on a trope, but it's connected to a line of thinking that has been deployed throughout the centuries since this.
Yeah.
Whereas this line in chapter 3 is less of a quote that's been used and more of an underlying mode of thinking about the Jews used by anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic people throughout the centuries. But it's not on the surface. It's more underneath what we've had to deal with. All right, let's go back to chapter 6. Any other thoughts about what Esther might be thinking or feeling during the events of this chapter? Okay, seeing none. I will end the recording.